My name's Michelle Thevenot. I'm a nature-inspired artist from Saskatchewan, Canada. This is how I made the sculpture within the raven's shadow. The vision began with a trip to the wilderness and close encounters with ravens. I began collecting reference photos and sketching out ideas for a layout. The concept involved using 3 separate logs joined together to create a massive raven. I selected some spruce logs, measured them, marked them with spray paint to coordinate with the dimensions of my reference photos. I used the chainsaw to cut them to length and set them up in my carving area outdoors. The basic outline of each piece was outlined with spray paint and blocked out with chainsaw. Once the front outline is blocked out, I return with the spray paint to outline the side profile. 1 log is the bird's body, and the 2 other logs are for the wings. I use the chainsaw to remove most of the bulk on the body, rounding out the corners and bringing out the basic shape. There's lots of redrawing and looking at reference photos to get the shape just right in this stage. I had some help with building a metal base that would display the bird in an aerial pose. The plan was to use 1-inch metal pipe to support the bird, which would slide into larger metal tubes welded to the base. I began with 1-inch wood dowel as working pieces for planning the angles and drilling holes on the underside of the bird. I still had a lot of wood to carve away from the sculpture, so I didn't want to worry about hitting metal in that process. The wings were still very bulky, so I continued to remove some excess material and shape them with the chainsaw before attaching it to the body. Working on them in tandem helped keep them symmetrical and balanced. The bird's body was rigged up using slings and an overhead winch hoist and installed on the base. The wing pieces were hoisted and fitted using the overhead hoist, test fitted and adjusted angles with the chainsaw several times until it was just right. The wings were glued to the body using a Nuflex Sealant 480 construction adhesive, then temporarily screwed in place. I let the adhesive cure overnight before drilling a 1-inch hole using a long spade bit through the wing and into the body in 2 places for each wing. A 1-inch wood dowel was glued and driven into each hole to help secure the wing to the body. I let it dry overnight, cut off the excess dowel, and repeat on the other wing. Each wing was further supported with an upright post. I chose to use temporary 1-inch wood dowel for working purposes since there was still a lot of carving work to do around those areas and I didn't want to risk dulling the tools by accidentally hitting the metal posts. Because of the cold weather, I decided to continue working indoors using a battery-operated chainsaw and an ArborTech industrial carver on an angle grinder to remove bulk and shape the bird. Reference photos and drawing measured lines to keep everything symmetrical continued to be an important aspect in this stage. Once the basic shape was smoothed out, I began planning the placement of details such as eyes, the beak opening, and feather groups. Finer shaping and transitions were defined using an angle grinder with an abrasive carving wheel. The ends of the wings and tail were planned to have feather extensions installed, so I carved in a groove using a chainsaw, and then further cleaned it out using a die grinder with a long cylinder burr bit. The die grinder and burr bits began to pull out details of the head and the feet. Next, I began working on the 44 feather extensions. I used 1x4s and 1/2-inch by 4-inch lumber. Using reference photos to help gauge size and length, I transferred the appropriate scaling and cut the pieces to length using a miter saw. The width of the boards were too thick to fit in the groove, so I used an angle grinder and a carving wheel to create a taper that would wedge into the groove. Test fitting, marking angles, and cutting off wedges helped make each feather custom fit in place next to the next. A charcoal pencil worked great to draw out the feather patterns across the bird. A bit of bird anatomy and feather pattern reference pictures go a long way in this step. It takes time to draw out the feathers, but it helps ensure an even pattern and lifelike flow when you get to carving. The larger feathers were initially outlined lightly using a chainsaw. And back to installing the feather extensions on the wings. I worked in feather pairs on the left and right sides, starting at the front. Each pair of feathers were cut to length and they're tapered, shaped in a similar manner to mirror each other and create balance. Minor adjustments might have included taking a little more material off one versus the other, or using little wood shims to change the angle slightly. Feather extensions were lightly tapped into the groove using a hammer and glued in place using outdoor wood glue. Any glue drips were buffed out using a burr bit and rotary tool later on. On to detailing the feathers. I used a Dremel rotary tool and a mini triangle cutter bit by Manpa Tools to create texture on the feather extensions. On the softer looking feathers of the body and the upper wings, I outlined and shaped each feather using a die grinder with burr bit, and later detailed further with the Dremel and mini triangle cutter bit. Once detailing was finished, I used a propane torch to lightly burn within the grooves and shadowed areas. It helped burn away some fuzzies and create a base of contrast. Next, I stained the wood using urethane one-step stain and polyurethane in the color Classic Black. It is very intense and full coverage color, and it dried to a matte finish. Once the stain was dry, I added some oil paint details around the eyes, the beak, and feet. Ravens have a natural sheen and iridescent quality to their feathers, so I combined a blue pearl powder to a gloss spar urethane to seal the wood carving. The shimmery blue really added a pop of color and reflected the light. I began considering how to finish the base. A raven's nest developed as the plan. I gathered dead poplar branches from the bush and air nailed them together to form the base of the nest. The next step used bendy willows woven together. Birds use all sorts of found materials in their nests. I used some reclaimed textile scraps cut into strips to weave into the nest for a pop of color. The cup of the nest was lined with softer materials such as grass, birch bark, and bits of natural fur left over from my previous sewing projects. An empty nest just didn't look right, so I returned to the chainsaw and angle grinder to carve 3 eggs. The small scale is difficult to work on because they move around so easily. A vice bench helped to hold them while I worked on them. The eggs were sanded well, then primed and painted. Plastic containers helped hold the eggs while the paint was drying. Within the spots of the eggs, I included symbolic runes that helped tell the story behind the raven sculpture. Of course, there's always cleanup at the end. Carving and sculpture is a messy business, but I'll never run out of firewood. The last step in the sculpture process was to move the carving outdoors, cover it with a tarp, and fumigate it with insect killer, just in case there are any creepy crawlies hiding in the wood. The raven, complete.